Greetings. We're back with another episode of Written for Our Admonition, and we're picking up with our first official discussion regarding the actual topic at hand, the beginning of all things. Our introduction last week was to set us up for this year of study talking about the Old Testament, the different themes that arise there, and just reviewing some of the history of the Old Testament so we understand what we're talking about as we proceed through our lessons that we're going to discuss. But of course, we have to go all the way back to the very beginning, not only in terms of the chronology of the Bible, going all the way back to the book of Genesis, but even going back to creation itself in the first chapter of Genesis, which will establish for us many different themes that we will see course their way throughout the entirety of the Old Testament and even into the New. So we start off with the beginning of all things with this declaration in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What an incredible declaration. When you think about what that declaration means, there is more depth to it than we'll have time to really consider in this one discussion. In fact, we could have dozens of discussions about this passage, and we would still not really be able to fully plumb the depths of what is available there in that statement. But right off the bat, we can draw this conclusion based upon what Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1 teaches us, that God has infinite power. He and He alone is the creator of the universe. All that exists, in the heavens, in the earth, wherever it happens to be, it only exists because of what God has done in it. It is only because of Him that we have been created. It is only because of Him that what we see around us exists. So He is the anchor and the basis of all things. There is no sense in Scripture, in the Old Testament or the New, where anyone or anything other than God is depicted as the Creator. And as we dig deep into Genesis chapter 1, we start to see more detail given to that thought of God being the Creator, and what that really means and what that implies about Him and His infinite power. Let's turn our attention then over to Genesis chapter 1. And here in Genesis chapter 1, we have a few thoughts we'd like to explore, but we're really just going to read this chapter. We'll go ahead and look at what it says in Genesis 1. We're not going to go over every single facet of this because we likely have some degree of familiarity with this, but we're going to hit the highlights as far as what this helps us understand about the Old Testament and how this will set us up for future discussions. So I would invite you to join me in the reading of Genesis chapter 1. I'm beginning with verse 1, and as I mentioned, we'll read to the end of the chapter. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. Then God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Thus God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. So the evening and the morning were the second day. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters He called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself, on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the third day. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. And then God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the fourth day. Then God said, "Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens." So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." So the evening and the morning were the fifth day. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth a living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, See, I have given you every herb that yields seed which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food. Also, to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food. And it was so. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Now, as you might imagine, that is quite the mouthful. But when we read that chapter, what we're really establishing with that is God's creative ability. The fact that he is responsible for all that exists. Did you notice that in each successive section, each successive day, God has created something else? He creates the water, he creates the light, he creates the earth, the plants that dwell on the earth, the animals that dwell on the earth, and finally human life. He creates all of it. It all originates with him. He is always seen that way, not only in this particular chapter, although this establishes all of that, but in every subsequent place we're going to find, he is always depicted as the creator. He is always the one responsible for what exists, and he is always glorified as a result. So what we just read there might be a bit dry to us. It might be repetitive to us. And yet it is so critical that we wrap our minds around what is said there so we understand that God is creative, that he is the one who made all of this, and that he is responsible for it. And that this then will establish many themes that we're going to find throughout the course of the Old Testament that are significant to understanding it as a whole. Let's consider a bit more about what this declaration teaches us beyond what we just read there in Genesis 1 and the fact that God created all that exists. We understand that fact quite well. It does not really require further elaboration. But let's dig deep into what this really implies to us and what we can take away from this to understand. I go to our next slide here, and I mention the fact that here, this is the primary reference point for God's power in the Old Testament, his creative work. Once again, I've already mentioned this multiple times, but I'll keep saying it because of how important it is for us to understand. God alone is the creator. And that naturally is going to knock out different theories and ideas that arise, but we're not here to go over those in great detail. But just understand that God is a creator. That is an open and shut case based upon what we just read in Genesis chapter 1. But the fact of the matter is that what that really teaches us about him is his great power. But not only does it teach us about his great power, it also teaches us about his thoughtfulness and his structured design. Creation is not just random. Although there are some that proclaim that it is random, there is simply no real evidence for that. Creation has a structure to it. There is a design to it. There are so many patterns that it's almost inescapable to realize that creation has some type of design to it. And even those that do not confess that God is a creator and do not really have much of a concept of that, nor do they agree with the idea of it, they can still acknowledge that there are patterns that exist in the universe. That is simply a fact of reality. But those patterns do not get there by accident or by coincidence. Those patterns exist because of a divine mind that has created those patterns, that has set them before us. Because wherever we find things that are created, we find patterns, we find blueprints, that is simply something that is an inescapable conclusion, no matter where you may be in respect to that understanding. But we really see God's thoughtfulness, we see his structure in all of this. And we see that in the Old Testament, that is given a lot of attention. So we're thinking specifically about the Psalms here. But in the Psalms, like in Psalm 8 that I have on the screen there in our slideshow, or Psalm 19, and any number of other Psalms, especially those written by David, you will find in those Psalms a significant amount of detail regarding the creation that God has made, and how thoughtful he was in creating it, and how that gives comfort to the psalmist, because the psalmist reflects on what God is able to do in creation and what he has accomplished, and the thought is, if God is able to form the mountains, if he is able to form all of these animals, these beasts of the field, these birds of the air, these fish of the sea, if he can do that, what can he do for me? How much my problems, how much my difficulties pale in comparison when I think about what God is able to do and what he has done in the past. So in a sense, this almost becomes an anchoring point for those who are faithful to God to think about what God has done in the past in terms of creation and what he is then able to do in the future because of what he has done in the past. That'll be a recurring theme, by the way, as we go throughout the Old Testament. But I want you to understand something else about how God's power in the creation account here is referred to in the Old Testament as well. We will not read these passages, but in Amos chapter 4 and Zechariah chapter 12, I have them on the screen there, you will find that the prophets will actually use the creative power of God in terms of judgment. So there it is not used in the context of a blessing like it is in the Psalms. There it is not depicted as a positive matter. There it is depicted as a warning to those who are living a wrong life, to those who are not faithful to the Lord, who are violating his covenant. We have not introduced that idea just yet, but we'll go back to that a little bit later. But we realize that this is a warning that is given in these prophets, and they use the creative power of God to amplify that warning. They'll say that God could form these mountains. He could bring the heavens together. He can do whatever he pleases with the power he has given and the power that he possesses. And here you stand in judgment. And if he's able to do all those things in creation, what hope do you have to escape? Now, it's a scary thought. We don't want to dwell on that too much. But we understand that that's an important idea that arises from God's creative power as it is depicted in Genesis chapter 1. Let's move forward a little bit here. Let's talk about how that of all that God has created, in Genesis chapter 1, specifically verses 26 or 27, it is humanity, male and female, that are treated as the most significant. Now, we want to understand something. That does not mean that plant and animal life has no value. There are some that get a bit imbalanced with this, and they start shifting in a direction that the text does not allow. We have to remember that while human beings are made in the image of God, which is what makes them significant, that does not make the plant life or the animal life insignificant. After all, as we read in Genesis chapter 1, what does man have dominion over? Plant life, animal life, and so on and so forth. But with that dominion becomes the idea of stewardship. That's a bit out of context for our conversation right now, but just understand that that plant life and that animal life matters. But humanity alone is made in the image of God, and that is a significant idea in the Old Testament. But what does it mean? Now again, we could have an entire discussion about what it means to be an image bearer. There's an entire body of doctrines that surround this idea, so we're not going to really be able to plummet the depths of what this really means in a 2 or 3 minute conversation. But I will mention a couple of ideas that are important for us to grasp. The basic idea of image bearing in the Old Testament, as is depicted in Genesis 1 that we read, is that human beings are special vessels of God. They have something within them that is unique to only them, that no other creature on the earth possesses. It is something that shows indelibly that they are his creation and that he has given them a special task and responsibility. So we have here this note on our slide that says this: humanity can reflect God's characteristics in how it thinks and acts, especially as it exercises authority over creation. Notice those details. So humanity can reflect God's characteristics. That's an important thought to understand. We're not saying that human beings are image bearers in the sense that they can do all that God does. Humanity is not all powerful. Humanity is not all knowing. Humanity is not ever present. Humanity is transient. Humanity is limited in its knowledge. Humanity is limited in its power. But it can reflect God's characteristics in terms of its morals, its thinking, the way that it conducts itself. Humanity most certainly can reflect God in those ways. In the New Testament, for instance, just to mention a passage in Ephesians 5, it would tell the Christians in Ephesus to be imitators of God. Now, how could Paul make a statement like that if it were impossible for humanity to reflect God's characteristics? But incidentally, that is what shows us that it is most certainly possible for human beings to do that. And because they are image bearers, this is what makes it possible for them to accomplish that. But it will be something that we'll find later as we go throughout the Old Testament. In fact, it will not be long now before we have this conversation, that the fact that humanity bears God's image is actually what will lead to the need for salvation. The fact that humanity and God have this special, unique relationship with each other at the very beginning here. It is obviously God's intention to have a unique relationship with humanity that goes beyond what he has with the animal and plant life. But the fact that that relationship exists and the fact that relationship will be jeopardized by what we'll talk about in our next episode sets us up for why salvation will become so necessary down the road. So this concept really speaks to a lot of what Scripture has to say. It may not be referred to that often outside of this passage in Genesis chapter 1, but that does not mean the idea does not resurface constantly in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. So human beings are the crown jewel of creation. They are the most significant in the created order. That is the way that God designed it to be. That is what his intention is, and he has a special relationship with them as a direct result. Finally, we come to this thought regarding God's creative work that we read in Genesis chapter 1. What God created was meant to be good. Did you notice what Genesis chapter 1 and verse 31 mentioned as a summary statement? It said there, just to remind you, that what God had made was very good. It was very good. And throughout the body of what we read in Genesis 1, it periodically will say that what God made was good, it was good in this respect. Whatever the case might be, it constantly says that about what God made. Because what God creates is always going to be good. It will always be ordered the way it's intended to be. It will always be structured that way because he is a perfect being. He does not make mistakes. And so all throughout the Old Testament, God's creative work will be talked about in those terms. And yet we find, as we're going to talk about in our next discussion, setting us up for that, it was not God's design to create a broken and sinful world, although it will become that way. But that's incidentally what sin does. And that shows that that's not what God's intention was. His intention was to make something very good, something that reflected him and his ways, something that showed forth his glory and his wonders. And yet sin is going to really ruin all of that. And it will be ruined through humanity's own choices. It is not as though God was the one who caused this to be. It's not as though that he said, well, it's time to make what I turned very good and make it into something very bad. That was not God's intention. That was not his will. But humanity, through its own choices, its own decision to rebel, will bring that forth, as we're going to find out in our next discussion. So all throughout the Old Testament and even the New Testament, the idea of creation being perfect from the beginning but being ruined by sin is going to become a very important idea. It's going to explain many things to us that may be hard for us to understand otherwise, apart from that truth. It's going to help us understand disease. It's going to help us understand the curses that have come upon the earth. It's going to help us understand death itself in many respects. Because God's intention was not for those things to be, and yet sin introduced those things to the world, ruined what God had made, and yet what God made can be restored. What God made can be brought back. And that once again helps us understand more themes that we'll find in the Old and New Testament, once more showing us the need for salvation that will come down the road. So just from Genesis chapter 1, we have learned a great deal about what the Old Testament is trying to communicate to us. We've already found that God is the creator of all that exists. Right off the bat, Genesis 1:1 is clear as could be. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. No one else can take credit for that. He is the creator of all things. He is the one who had the power to do it. He did not have to exert effort. He merely spoke it, and it came to pass. We found then, as a result of that the power of God is always referred to back in terms of his power in creation. The fact that he can and did create the world and brought forth the universe as we see it today, that is a reference point for his power throughout Old and New Testament. We talked about how mankind is the crown jewel of that creation. The fact that God made humanity to be significant in it, and that he would have a unique relationship with humanity that he does not have with other creatures. But then we also found that that would be jeopardized a little bit later, which will lead us to our next conversation later down the road. But then we also find in our final part of the discussion we had today that what God created was meant to be good, and yet it's not going to remain that way. But his intention, his design was for it to be very good, for it to be proper, for it to be structured. But sin is going to bring that to an end, and there's going to have to be a period of restoration or renewal. But that'll be something we have to revisit a little bit later. That's all we have for our discussion today. But I hope this has helped you understand the significance of creation as it's presented in Genesis 1. Our goal was not to go over every detail of those verses that we read in Genesis 1. Those are things that we could talk about at a separate occasion. But really to understand why that text matters to us. What does it actually teach us? What can we reflect on? And how does it set us up for later texts in the Old Testament? We're especially going to see in our next discussion how it all fits together, because the creation account and the account of the fall of mankind or the fall of humanity, those go hand in hand. But we'll have to wait till next week to get to that discussion. So I'd invite you to stick around next week and hear about that some more, to learn more about this. But for the time being, I appreciate your time and attention to this, and we'll have further conversations later. Thank you.